Chief Barker, thanks so much for your time.
Of course.
So you've been interim since the beginning of the year, but now pending City Council confirmation, you are the permanent police chief of the Albuquerque Police Department. What changes now in terms of latitude or freedom in your role?
I think it's, being in the permanent role, I have the opportunity, as an interim, Mayor gave me the opportunity to review my staffing and make some changes, but now I'll have that opportunity to look even broader and wider, take a look at what changes need to be made, if any, and then just making those final decisions.
You mentioned those staffing changes. You did do some shaking up in the interim role. You got rid of a dozen executive positions back in early January in your first week. Why was that such an early priority for you?
We had several positions within the department that came as a part of the consent decree. And so a lot of that was oversight that was just no longer needed. Some of those positions were not currently filled, and we didn't need a reason to, bring them back.
And so you say that the positions weren't really needed anymore once the consent decree was no longer enacted. Did that in some ways declare kind of a mission accomplished?
I have made it clear both within the department and outside of the department, we are out of the consent decree, but those accountability measures are still very important to me and our police department.
And you have the staffing at the higher levels to get that done?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you served as deputy chief, as you mentioned, under former Chief Harold Medina, beginning in 2021. Some of his detractors have called you a Medina loyalist. What is your reaction to that?
I worked for Chief Medina when I first came on the department. He was my sergeant, and I worked for him, I think, a year or two. Didn't really speak to him between that time. We see each other in passing and stuff like that. One thing I can say about my relationship with him is just I was always a worker. And Chief Medina would tell you this too, we're not friends outside of the department. We have a professional working relationship. I think you can talk to officers within the department and people outside, and they would all agree that we have different personalities. I respect him very much as a supervisor and what he did for our police department, but I bring a different perspective.
What are those different perspectives that you bring?
So he, where he came up through the department was through property crimes and auto theft. He's talked a lot about that. I have a very diverse background. I worked field services as a patrol officer for most of my career in uniform. And then as a supervisor, I worked in violent crimes at the Family Advocacy Center, a very victim-oriented purpose and driven. I also worked at the crime lab. And so I have a broader perspective of the department. Not to say that he didn't, but I also just approach things differently as a leader.
And how does that broader perspective, how is it going to show up? How will Albuquerque residents see it show up, or in any policy changes that they can expect, or even just your approach to the work?
I've made some changes as far as just accountability, looking at Duke City Stat. It's a meeting we have once a week. It's very crime driven, but we're going to put reports back into that accountability measures for the area commanders. And so that's going to include, looking at misconduct violations by area command and squad, just to see specifically if we have any trends, like with a specific supervisor, or what that might look like.
Okay. And you've been working your way up at APD for over 2 decades. Mm-hmm. This was the department that you started at, and you were the internal candidate for this national search for the next chief. Some pro-reform folks were hoping to see an outside candidate with a fresh perspective come in. What would you say to them about why you're the right fit as an internal candidate?
As an internal candidate coming up through the ranks, I bring that knowledge, right, from every level. I was here before we were under a consent decree. I was here during a consent decree, and I am here after the consent decree. And I think that's really important knowledge that someone coming in from the outside wouldn't have. I also know the culture of our police department and, what needs to be addressed. I'm not saying that someone couldn't come in from the outside and be successful, but I do think that I have an advantage.
The DOJ, the Department of Justice, during that investigation that led to the consent decree, identified a culture of aggression at APD. You mentioned you were at APD before the consent decree was in place. In those before times, did you see policing that bothered you?
I did. And I think when I became a supervisor, I made it very clear that I was going to be visible and hold people accountable. I also saw policing that was done right. I remember when the independent monitors came and they were doing ride-alongs, and I told my officers, just do what you would normally do. Don't act any different. They need to see how we treat people as a department and how we act. But, historically, I can look at different officer involved shootings and see things that we could have done better. And that's what we're going to continue to do is, monitor what our use of force policy looks like, how we can continue to advance that and make things better as a department.
You have a relative on the police force, Jeff Bloodworth,
I do.
who shot and killed Vincent Wood, a black man with a knife back in 2013. How did going through that experience impact how you viewed APD police shootings and DOJ oversight for that matter?
That's a really good question. What I remember about one of those specific shootings is the police chief at the time coming up, and the only question that he asked my brother, because I was the buddy officer at the time, was your camera on? Now, I will tell you, as a supervisor and as a leader in police reform, I specifically worked on the OBRD policy, so the camera policy, and I think it is 100% beneficial, and I have always been about that. But when you have an officer who's involved in an incident like that can't be the only question that is asked. An officer has to do what they can to protect themselves and the community. And so that's something that's always stuck out in my mind. I want my officers to know that I'm there for them. Like, policy is important, transparency is important, what we do is very important, but we also have to remember that there's a human side to this as well, right? And so I want my officers to know that I'm there to support them. So those are just a couple of things that, come to my mind when I think about the shootings that he was involved in.
All right. And now, what is your message to the officers and the police union who didn't see the consent decree as something that should have been entered into the first place, or didn't see the results as what they had hoped that they might turn out to be?
I have always said that, we have room to do better, and we always will, right? We always have to look at that. I have had very candid conversations with officers who have said, like, there wasn't a reason for the DOJ to be here, or, they put us in a bad place. We can always do better. And I think that we are a much stronger, transparent department since the DOJ came here. I will put us up against any other department in the state and the country, and we're not perfect, but you're going to see more professionalism, more de-escalation when you watch OBRD in comparison to other agencies.
One of your responsibilities as the police chief is to build morale. It's in the job description. Where is morale on the force today, and how will you go about building it up further?
I think our morale is in a very good place. Coming out of the consent decree has increased that, mostly because it's a success story, right? And you will have people who, we're not perfect. I've said that several times, just sitting here today. But coming out of that was a huge challenge, and it's something that we were successful in doing that you don't see other agencies do. I also think our department is getting back to a culture of teamwork. There used to be a time where it was a bureau against bureau, so like field services against the detective bureau, just, who was doing what, and we're really trying to bring back that team mentality.
Well, morale's one thing, accountability is another. It's a term that you've already used several times tonight. What does accountability look like moving forward following the consent decree?
Accountability is just ensuring that people know that they're going to be, held responsible for any misconduct that they do, reviewing policy and making sure that we have the right procedures in place. Like we've been talking about, the consent decree is gone, but that does not mean that we don't, we're not going to change our policies as far as holding people accountable.
How do you ensure that the systems that the consent decree put in place are strong?
So we have analysts within our police department, and those scorecards are going to tell us. We're going to use data to show, again, where those trends are, identifying them, and then addressing them. Each week, even in our executive meetings, we look at the area commands where uses of force are happening, and then talk about, okay, what is the reason? A specific area command or location, is that team doing strictly proactive work? So does that explain, they have more contacts than the average officer?
And now we're talking about all of these systems that are now in place, the accountability structures that exist for you to be able to employ. Yet Albuquerque still ranks as the second highest in the nation for police killings by population, a rate of 11 per 1 million residents, with black people killed at 4 times the rate of white people in this city. How can that be if the reform effort was as successful as you're saying?
I absolutely hear what you're saying, and I understand, where the community comes from when that's concerning. What I can say about the officer-involved shootings that we have had, specifically to last year, 10 of the 11 fatalities, those individuals all had some type of narcotic in their system, and they have weapons. We do review all of our officer-involved shootings, so we have the Force Review Board that looks at that, and then the multi-agency task force. And so there are accountability measures in place to ensure that they are justified or fall within policy.
But I imagine, of course, you want to see fewer
Absolutely.
officers
Yes.
killing residents here. How do you work to see just fewer shootings, regardless of whether they're deemed constitutional?
I mean, first things first, I'm going to say the number one thing is I want an officer to go home safe. But we have worked on and will continue to work on our de-escalation, not only policy but training, making sure that our officers are doing everything they can to prevent something like this.
Chief Barker, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to stick around with us. We got a few more questions.
All right, sounds great.
Thanks.